"If you've got $6, I'm done here," Stephen Whitmore said, his voice just loud enough to carry across the dining room, just sharp enough to cut through the low hum of clinking glasses and quiet conversations, and for a split second, the entire restaurant seemed to lean in, like it was waiting for something more, something better, something crueler to follow. And then the laughter came, scattered at first, a few chuckles from a corner table, a short burst from the bar, until it spread like a ripple across polished wood and white linen, bouncing off crystal glasses and the soft amber glow of overhead lights, turning the moment into something shared, something agreed upon, something that made it easier not to look too closely at the man standing near the entrance, the man who hadn't laughed, hadn't moved, hadn't even lifted his eyes from the table in front of him, as if the words had landed somewhere far deeper than sound, as if they had settled into a place he had learned long ago not to react from. Elijah Carter stood there in a worn coat that had once been black but had faded into something softer, something tired, the fabric creased and frayed at the cuffs, his shoes carrying the dull dust of sidewalks and long miles, yet his posture was steady, not defiant, not submissive, just still, like a man who understood the weight of silence better than most people understood the weight of words. And in front of him, on the edge of a table meant for guests who never had to think about prices or tips, lay a single bill folded carefully, almost respectfully, as though it mattered more than its value suggested. Stephen adjusted his tie, the subtle sheen of it catching the light, his reflection briefly visible in the dark glass of a nearby window. A man who knew this space, who controlled it, who belonged to it in a way that felt unquestioned, and he tapped the edge of the table with 2 fingers. Impatient, rehearsed, the kind of gesture that came from years of managing expectations, setting boundaries, deciding who stayed and who left, and tonight, it was clear where Elijah stood in that quiet hierarchy. The room, still buzzing with the aftertaste of laughter, began to settle back into itself, forks lifting, conversations resuming, but not quite the same. Because something lingered in the air, something thin and almost invisible, like the faint echo of a sound that refused to fully disappear, and a few eyes remained fixed on Elijah. Curious now, not amused, waiting to see if he would argue, or apologize, or turn and walk out like so many others had before him. But Elijah didn't move, not yet, his gaze still lowered, not in defeat, but in focus. As if he were measuring something unseen, something internal, and then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, he reached into the inside pocket of his coat, his hand moving with care, not hurried, not hesitant, just deliberate, and the faint rustle of fabric seemed louder than it should have been, drawing attention in a way that no raised voice could have, and Stephen noticed it too, his expression tightening for a fraction of a second, a flicker of irritation crossing his face before settling back into practiced control. Because this was supposed to be simple, clean, forgettable, the kind of interaction that ended with the door closing and a story no one bothered to remember, and yet something about the way Elijah stood there, the way he hadn't reacted, hadn't matched the tone, hadn't given the room what it expected, began to shift the balance of the moment, just slightly, just enough to make the laughter feel a little too loud in hindsight, a little too easy. And as Elijah's fingers closed around whatever rested inside his pocket, the air itself seemed to tighten, like a held breath, stretching just a second too long, and somewhere between the glow of the lights and the reflection in the glass, the room that had laughed only moments ago started to quiet again, not all at once, not dramatically, but in pieces, in pauses, in glances that lingered a fraction longer than before, as if something unseen had entered the space and was slowly asking everyone to pay attention, even if they didn't yet know why. Elijah Carter's fingers moved slowly inside the worn lining of his coat, not searching, not fumbling, but finding something that had been placed there with intention long before he stepped through the restaurant doors, and as he drew his hand back out, he did not reveal what he held right away, instead letting it rest in his palm, partially hidden, as if even now he was deciding whether this moment deserved it, whether the room that had laughed only seconds ago had earned the truth he carried with him. His shoulders remained relaxed, his breathing steady, and up close, there was something about his face that did not match the story people had already written for him. The lines were not just from hardship, but from patience, from years of watching, of learning when to speak and when to let silence do the work. And though his clothes told one story, his eyes told another, clear, focused, almost distant, as if the present moment was only one small point in a much longer timeline that he alone could see. Behind him, the glass door let in a faint draft from the street, cool air brushing against the warmth of the dining room, carrying with it the distant hum of traffic and the occasional echo of footsteps on concrete, reminders of a world that moved differently outside these walls. A world Elijah knew far better than anyone seated at those polished tables, and yet he stood here now, between both spaces, not quite belonging to either in the way people expected. Stephen Whitmore watched him more closely now, the practiced confidence still in place, but thinner, stretched slightly by something he could not yet name, because this was not how these moments usually went. There was supposed to be a reaction, an apology, an exit, something that restored the balance quickly and cleanly. But Elijah's stillness had interrupted that rhythm, had introduced a pause where there should have been resolution, and pauses, Stephen knew, could be dangerous when they lasted too long. A server passing by slowed just enough to glance over, her tray balanced carefully, the soft clink of glasses marking time in a room that had grown subtly quieter again. And at a nearby table, a man who had laughed earlier now shifted in his seat, his smile fading into something uncertain, his gaze flicking between Stephen and Elijah as if trying to understand what had changed, because something had, even if no one had said it out loud. Elijah finally lifted his eyes, not sharply, not with challenge, but with a calm that felt almost out of place in a moment built on tension, and when his gaze met Stephen's, it did not carry anger or resentment, only recognition, the kind that suggested this was not the first time he had stood in a room like this, not the first time he had been measured and dismissed in the span of a few seconds, and yet there was no urgency in him to correct it, no need to prove himself in the way people expected, as if he understood that truth did not rush, it arrived when it was ready. The object in his hand shifted slightly as he adjusted his grip, the edge of it catching the light just enough to draw a few more curious glances, but still he did not reveal it, not fully, not yet, and instead, he let his hand lower gently toward the table, placing whatever he held beside the folded bill with a quiet precision that felt deliberate, almost ceremonial, the sound it made against the polished surface soft but distinct, a small interruption that seemed to echo louder than it should have, because now the room was listening in a different way, not for laughter, but for meaning. Stephen's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, his eyes flicking down for a brief second, before returning to Elijah's face, and in that fraction of a moment, something shifted again, something subtle but real, because whatever Elijah had placed on that table had weight, not necessarily in size or cost, but in presence, in the way it demanded to be acknowledged even before it was understood, and the distance between them, once defined by status and assumption, began to feel less certain, less stable. Like a line drawn in sand just before the tide turns, Elijah's hand remained near the table for a moment longer, fingers relaxed, not guarding what he had set down, not hiding it, simply allowing it to exist there, to be seen when others were ready to truly look, and as he straightened slightly, the overhead light caught his face in a way that softened the edges of his expression, revealing not defeat, not submission, but something quieter and far more difficult to dismiss. A kind of dignity that did not ask for permission and did not depend on approval, and in that growing silence, where even the smallest movements seemed amplified, it became clear that whatever was about to happen next would not follow the script anyone in that room had expected. The object resting beside the folded bill did not announce itself with shine or size, but it carried a quiet gravity that began to pull attention toward it, one pair of eyes at a time, like a slow tide shifting beneath the surface of a calm shore, and for a moment, no one spoke, not even Stephen Whitmore, whose authority usually filled every silence before it had a chance to grow. He looked down again, this time longer, his gaze narrowing slightly as his mind worked to categorize what he was seeing, because it did not fit neatly into the assumptions he had already made, and that alone created a small but undeniable crack in his certainty. Elijah Carter remained still, his hands now resting lightly at his sides, his posture unchanged, as if the act of placing that object on the table had completed something internal, something that did not require explanation or defense, and the light above them reflected faintly off the surface of the item, revealing just enough detail to make it recognizable. But not yet understood, a thin edge, a clean line, something official. Something that did not belong to the version of Elijah that had been laughed at only moments ago. Across the room, a woman who had been stirring her drink paused mid-motion, the eyes settling with a soft clink against the glass, her eyes fixed on the table now, her earlier amusement replaced by a quiet curiosity that felt almost cautious, as if she sensed that the story unfolding in front of her was no longer simple, no longer predictable. And at the bar, a man leaned forward slightly, elbows resting on polished wood, his attention fully captured in a way that no menu or conversation had managed all evening. Stephen reached out, not quickly, not aggressively, but with a controlled motion that suggested he was still in charge, still dictating the pace of what came next, and his fingers hovered for just a fraction of a second before making contact with the object. As if even he felt the need to pause before crossing whatever invisible line it represented. When he finally touched it, the room seemed to contract, the background noise fading into something distant and irrelevant, and as he lifted it slightly, turning it just enough for the light to catch the details, his expression shifted, not dramatically, not in a way that anyone could easily name, but in a subtle tightening around the eyes. A faint change in the set of his mouth, the kind of reaction that happens before words catch up to realization. Elijah watched him, not with expectation, not with satisfaction, but with a steady calm that suggested he had seen this moment before, in different places, with different faces, the exact point where assumption meets contradiction and has nowhere to go but inward. The object in Stephen's hand was simple in form, but precise, a card, not worn or damaged, but clean, maintained, bearing markings that spoke of something structured, something earned, something that did not align with the image of a man standing in a faded coat with dust on his shoes. And as Stephen's eyes moved across its surface, reading, processing, recalibrating, the silence in the room deepened, no longer uncertain, but focused, as if everyone present had collectively realized that they had missed something important. Something that had been there from the beginning but had gone unseen. A server stopped mid-step a few feet away, her tray balanced carefully as she watched, her usual rhythm interrupted by the weight of the moment, and near the entrance, the faint sound of the door opening and closing went unnoticed, swallowed by the stillness that now held the room in place. Stephen lowered the card slightly, his grip tightening just enough to reveal the tension beneath his composed exterior, and when he looked back up at Elijah, the dynamic between them had shifted in a way that could not be undone. Not by words, not by authority, because whatever he had just read had introduced a truth that did not bend to perception, a truth that existed whether the room accepted it or not. Elijah's expression remained unchanged, his gaze steady, not demanding recognition, not seeking validation, simply present, as if he understood that what mattered was not how quickly the room understood, but that it eventually would. And as the seconds stretched, each one heavier than the last, it became clear that the laughter from earlier had not just faded, it had been replaced, not by noise, but by something far more powerful, a silence filled with realization, with reconsideration, with the slow, undeniable shift of perspective that no one in that room had been prepared for. Stephen Whitmore did not immediately return the card to the table, and that hesitation, that small break in his usual rhythm, did not go unnoticed, because in a room built on confidence and control, even the slightest pause from someone like him carried weight. And now that weight pressed down on every table, every quiet glance, every breath that seemed just a little too measured. His thumb brushed lightly across the surface of the card as if confirming that it was real, as if expecting it to dissolve into something more familiar, something easier to dismiss. But it remained exactly what it was, solid, precise, undeniable. And the information printed across it continued to settle into his thoughts in a way that resisted quick interpretation, forcing him to reconsider not just the man standing in front of him, but the assumptions that had led to this moment in the first place. Elijah Carter did not rush to explain, did not fill the silence with justification or history. Instead, allowing Stephen the space to arrive at understanding on his own, and that choice, that restraint, carried its own kind of authority, one That did not rely on position or title, but on certainty, on the quiet knowledge that truth did not need to be defended when it was clear enough to stand on its own. A faint hum from the overhead lights seemed louder now, filling the gaps between movements, and somewhere near the back of the room, a chair shifted slightly against the floor, the sound brief but noticeable, as if the environment itself had become more sensitive, more aware of every small detail unfolding within it. Stephen finally lowered the card back toward the table, but he did not release it right away, his fingers holding on to the edge just long enough to suggest that letting go meant accepting something he had not yet fully processed, and when he did place it down, it was done with a care that had not been there before, a subtle shift from dismissal to consideration that spoke louder than any immediate apology could have. His eyes lifted again to meet Elijah's. And this time there was a question in them, not spoken. Not formed into words, but present, searching, trying to reconcile the image of the man in front of him with the reality implied by that small, unassuming object. Elijah's gaze remained steady, not pressing, not accusing, simply present, offering nothing more than the truth already laid out between them, and in that stillness, it became clear that whatever came next would not be guided by pride or performance, but by recognition, by the slow and often uncomfortable process of seeing something clearly after having missed it entirely. Around them, the room continued to adjust, conversations that had once flowed easily now paused more frequently, voices lowered. Attention divided between what people had been doing and what they were now witnessing, and the earlier laughter, once so quick and effortless, felt distant, almost misplaced, as if it belonged to a different moment, a different understanding that no longer held up under the weight of what was unfolding. Stephen's posture shifted slightly, the rigid line of his shoulders softening just enough to suggest that something internal had begun to move, something that could not be reversed simply by returning to the script he had followed countless times before. Because this situation no longer fit that script, it demanded something else, something less familiar and far more revealing. He inhaled slowly, the breath measured, controlled, but not entirely steady, and though he had not yet spoken, the room could sense that words were coming, words that would either restore the balance he had once held so easily or acknowledge the shift that had already taken place. Elijah remained where he was, not stepping forward, not stepping back, allowing the distance between them to exist as it was, no longer defined by status alone, but by the truth that now occupied the space between them, a truth that had been introduced quietly, without force, yet carried enough weight to change everything about how this moment would be remembered. And as the seconds stretched, each one layered with expectation and realization, it became clear that the power in the room had not disappeared, it had simply moved, redirected away from where it had always been assumed to reside and towards something far less visible but far more enduring, something that could not be taken, only revealed. Stephen Whitmore finally spoke, but the confidence that once carried his voice had shifted into something more measured, more cautious, as if each word now had to pass through a layer of thought that had not been there before, and even though his tone remained controlled, there was a subtle tension beneath it, a quiet strain that suggested he was no longer certain of his footing. He cleared his throat lightly, the sound small but noticeable in the stillness, and his eyes flicked once more to the card resting on the table before returning to Elijah Carter, as though confirming again that what he had seen had not changed in the last few seconds. "Where did you get this?" he asked, the question simple on the surface, but carrying a deeper implication, one that revealed he was still trying to reconcile the reality in front of him with the version of events his mind had already constructed. Elijah did not answer immediately, not out of hesitation, but out of intention, allowing the question to settle, to exist fully in the space between them, and when he finally spoke, his voice was calm, steady, and unforced, carrying neither defensiveness nor pride, only clarity. "I did not get it anywhere," he said quietly, his words landing with a weight that did not need volume to be felt. "It was given to me a long time ago." And with that, he let the meaning rest there, unexpanded, as if the truth did not require embellishment to be understood. Stephen's jaw tightened slightly, the muscles along his cheek shifting as he processed the response, and though he did not immediately react, the room could feel the pressure building again, not from conflict this time, but from the growing awareness that something significant had been overlooked, something that could not simply be dismissed or explained away. A man seated near the window leaned back in his chair, his earlier amusement completely gone now, replaced by a quiet attentiveness, his eyes moving between Elijah and Stephen as if trying to piece together a story that was only now beginning to reveal itself. The soft glow of the overhead lights reflected off the polished surfaces around them, creating a warm, almost serene atmosphere that stood in contrast to the tension threading through the air, and in that contrast, every movement, every glance, every breath seemed amplified, carrying more meaning than it normally would. Stephen shifted his weight slightly, the subtle adjustment of his stance betraying a discomfort he would not have acknowledged just minutes earlier, and he reached again for the card, this time turning it fully toward himself, his eyes scanning it more carefully, more deliberately, as if searching for something he might have missed, something that could restore the sense of control he was used to maintaining. But the card did not change, and neither did what it represented, and as the seconds passed, the reality of that began to settle more firmly into place, pressing against the edges of his composure. Elijah watched him without interruption, his expression unchanged, not offering guidance, not correcting, simply allowing Stephen to arrive at his own conclusion, and in that quiet patience, there was a kind of strength that did not demand attention but commanded it nonetheless. The room, now fully attentive, seemed to hold its breath, the earlier rhythm of conversation and movement replaced by a collective stillness that centered entirely on the space between the two men, a space that had transformed from one of casual dismissal into something far more significant, something that now carried the weight of truth and recognition. Stephen lowered the card once more, this time setting it down with a gentleness that contrasted sharply with the dismissive gesture he had made earlier when placing the bill on the table, and when he looked up again, there was something different in his eyes, something that had not been there before, not quite understanding yet, but no longer ignorance either, something in between, something that suggested the beginning of a shift he could not easily reverse. And in that moment, it became clear that the tension in the room was no longer about whether Elijah would leave or stay, but about what Stephen would do next, because the balance had changed, the assumptions had been challenged, and whatever came after this would not simply return things to the way they had been before, no matter how much anyone might have expected it to. The silence that followed did not feel empty, it felt full, dense with something unspoken, something that pressed gently against every person in the room, asking them to sit with it, to feel it, to recognize that what had just shifted could not be undone by simply moving on, and Elijah Carter stood at the center of it without moving, his presence steady, almost grounding, as though he had carried this kind of moment before and knew exactly how to let it unfold without forcing it. A faint reflection of the overhead lights shimmered across the polished table, catching the edge of the card, the folded bill, and the quiet stillness of Elijah's hand resting nearby, and in that reflection, everything seemed softer, less defined by status or assumption, more defined by what was real and present. Stephen Whitmore did not speak again right away, his gaze lingering on the space between them, no longer fixed on control, but searching, recalibrating, and for the first time since the moment began, he looked uncertain, not in a way that diminished him, but in a way that revealed something human beneath the surface he had built over years of managing appearances and expectations. He inhaled slowly, the breath deeper this time, as if he were allowing himself a moment to step back from the role he had been playing, and when he exhaled, his shoulders lowered just slightly, the rigid line easing into something more natural, more real. Elijah noticed it, not with surprise, but with quiet acknowledgement, because he understood that change rarely arrived all at once, it came in small adjustments, in subtle shifts that only became clear when you allowed yourself to see them. Somewhere near the entrance, the soft sound of the door opening let in a brief rush of cooler air, brushing against the warmth of the room, and for a second, the outside world felt close again, a reminder that life continued beyond this moment, beyond this space, and yet no one moved toward it, no one broke the stillness, because whatever was happening here had not yet reached its end. A woman at a nearby table lowered her glass slowly, placing it down with care as if not to disturb the quiet, her eyes fixed on Elijah now, not with judgment, not with pity, but with something closer to respect, a recognition that had not been there before, and at the bar, a man who had once leaned forward out of curiosity now sat back, his posture more reflective, as if he were reconsidering not just what he had seen, but how quickly he had accepted the earlier narrative. Stephen's hand moved slightly, not toward the card this time, but toward the edge of the table, his fingers resting there, grounding himself in the present, and when he finally looked directly at Elijah again, there was a different kind of awareness in his eyes, one that suggested he was beginning to understand that this moment was not about a transaction, not about a few dollars or a misplaced assumption, but about something far more fundamental, something that touched on how people see each other, how quickly they decide, and how rarely they pause long enough to question those decisions. Elijah remained composed, his breathing even, his gaze steady, offering no resistance, no challenge, simply existing in the truth he had already placed before them, and in that quiet presence, there was a kind of invitation, not to defend, not to explain, but to reflect, to reconsider. To see more clearly. The room, once filled with movement and noise, now held a different kind of energy, one that felt almost fragile, as if any sudden word or gesture could break it, and yet no one seemed willing to be the one to do so, because beneath that fragility was something meaningful, something worth holding on to for just a little longer. Stephen's lips parted slightly, as if he were about to speak, then paused again, not out of hesitation alone, but out of care. As if he understood now that whatever he said next would carry weight, not just for Elijah, but for everyone who had witnessed the moment from the beginning, everyone who had laughed, who had watched, who had now fallen silent. And in that pause, in that space where words had not yet been chosen, the true shift became undeniable, because the power that once came from certainty had given way to something quieter, something more difficult, the willingness to see, to question, and perhaps, to change. Stephen Whitmore finally spoke, and this time his voice did not carry the same edge, it did not reach for control or authority, instead it came slower, quieter, as if each word had been weighed before it was allowed to exist. "Elijah Carter," he said, glancing briefly at the card again, not to verify, but to acknowledge, and the simple act of saying the name correctly shifted something in the room, something subtle but undeniable, because recognition, even in its smallest form, has a way of changing everything. He paused after the name, his breath catching slightly as though he had stepped into unfamiliar territory, a space where certainty no longer guided him. And for a moment, it seemed like he might stop there, might retreat back into silence, but he did not, because the truth now sitting between them demanded more than avoidance. I did not realize," he continued, and the sentence trailed just enough to reveal its incompleteness, because realization was not a single moment, it was a process unfolding in real time, and everyone in the room could see it happening, could feel it shifting through him as he stood there, no longer the unquestioned authority, but a man confronting something he had overlooked. Elijah Carter did not respond immediately, his expression unchanged, his presence steady, allowing the words to land without interruption, without judgment, and in that quiet acceptance there was a kind of grace that made the moment feel less like a confrontation and more like a revelation. Stephen's eyes moved once more across the room, not with command this time, but with awareness, as if he were seeing the space differently, noticing the people who had laughed, the ones who now sat in silence, the subtle changes in posture and expression that reflected a shared understanding beginning to take shape. "This place," he said slowly, his voice softer now, almost reflective, "it opened 10 years ago." And as he spoke, the words seemed to connect with something deeper, something beyond the present moment, something tied to history, to decisions made long before this evening, and his gaze returned to Elijah, searching, uncertain but sincere. Elijah's eyes held his, calm and unwavering, and then, with the same measured tone he had used from the beginning, he spoke. "Yes, it did." And the simplicity of the response carried more meaning than any explanation could have, because it confirmed what Stephen was beginning to piece together, what the card had already suggested, what the moment itself had been building toward. A quiet murmur moved through the room, not loud, not disruptive, but present, as people began to connect the fragments, to understand that this was not just a misunderstanding, not just a misplaced judgment, but something larger, something rooted in a past that had gone unseen. Stephen's posture shifted again, his shoulders lowering slightly as the realization settled more fully, and he looked at Elijah with a different kind of focus now, one that carried both recognition and a hint of regret, not exaggerated, not spoken outright, but visible in the way his expression softened, and the way his stance adjusted to meet the moment rather than control it. "You were here," he said, the words coming together slowly, carefully, as if he were stepping through them one at a time. "Back then. And..." Though it was phrased as a statement, there was still a question within it, a need for confirmation that what he was beginning to understand was real. Elijah gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, not dramatic, not drawn out, just enough to affirm the truth without elaborating. And in that gesture, the final piece seemed to fall into place, not just for Stephen, but for everyone watching. The room, already quiet, seemed to deepen into a more profound stillness, the kind that comes not from uncertainty, but from recognition, from the moment when something becomes clear in a way that cannot be ignored. Stephen's gaze dropped briefly to the table, to the card, to the folded bill that now felt insignificant in comparison, and when he looked up again, there was no trace of the earlier dismissal, only the weight of understanding settling into his expression, changing the way he stood, the way he looked, the way he was seen. Elijah remained as he was, grounded, composed, not seeking acknowledgement, not demanding anything from the moment, because what needed to be understood had already been revealed, and in the quiet space that followed, it became clear that the story unfolding in that room was no longer about who had been right or wrong, but about what happens when truth is finally seen for what it is, without distraction, without assumption, and without the comfort of looking away. Stephen Whitmore let out a slow breath, the kind that seemed to come from deeper than the moment itself, as if it carried not just the weight of what had just been revealed, but the quiet realization of everything that had been missed leading up to it. And when he looked at Elijah Carter again, there was no trace of the earlier distance in his expression, no barrier of assumption or authority. Only a clarity that had arrived too late to prevent the moment, but just in time to change what came. Next, his hand moved toward the table, not to reclaim control, but to gently slide the folded bill back toward Elijah, the gesture careful, almost deliberate, as though he understood now that it no longer represented what it had before, and for a brief second, his fingers hovered there, resting lightly on the edge of the paper, before he withdrew them, leaving the space between them open, unguarded. "You should not have been treated like that," he said quietly, the words simple, unembellished, and because of that, they carried more weight than anything louder or more elaborate could have, and though the apology was not framed with formality, it was unmistakable in its intent, in the way his voice softened, in the way his posture no longer leaned forward with expectation, but settled into something more balanced, more human. Elijah listened without interruption. His gaze steady, not hardened, not dismissive, but reflective, as if he were considering not just the words themselves, but the space they came from, the shift that had made them possible. And after a moment, he gave a small nod, not as acceptance or dismissal, but as acknowledgement, a recognition that what had been said mattered, even if it did not erase what had already happened. The room, still quiet, seemed to lean into that exchange. The tension that had once filled it now transforming into something softer, something closer to understanding, and at a nearby table, a woman who had watched the entire moment unfold lowered her eyes briefly, her expression thoughtful, as if she were reconsidering not just what she had seen, but how quickly she had participated in it. Stephen's gaze moved across the room again, this time not searching for control, but taking in the people around him, the subtle shifts in their expressions, the way the atmosphere had changed, and for a moment, it was clear that he understood the impact of what had occurred, not just for himself, but for everyone who had witnessed it, because moments like this did not stay contained, they lingered, they followed people beyond the walls where they happened. He turned back to Elijah, his voice quieter still. "If you are willing," he began, then paused, not out of uncertainty, but out of care, choosing his words with a precision that had not been there before. "I would like to make this right." And the statement was not a command, not an expectation, but an offering, one that acknowledged that the balance of the moment no longer rested solely with him, Elijah's expression did not change immediately, his eyes holding Stephen's with the same calm presence he had carried from the beginning, and for a second, it seemed as though he might decline, might simply walk away and leave the moment as it was, complete in its own way, but instead, he glanced briefly at the table, at the card, at the folded bill, and then back to Stephen, his gaze thoughtful, measured. "Making it right does not happen in one moment," he said quietly, his voice steady, grounded in something deeper than the room around them, and though the words were simple, they carried a truth that settled into the space with a quiet finality, one that did not reject Stephen's attempt, but reframed it, placing it within a larger understanding. Stephen nodded slowly, absorbing the response, not resisting it, not trying to reshape it into something easier, but accepting it as it was, and in that acceptance, there was a shift that went beyond the immediate exchange, something that suggested he was beginning to understand that this moment was not about fixing what had happened, but about learning from it, carrying it forward in a way that would change what came after. Elijah remained still for a moment longer, then gently reached for the card, lifting it from the table with the same quiet care he had used when placing it there, and as he held it in his hand once more, the room seemed to settle into a new kind of silence, not tense, not uncertain, but reflective, as if everyone present had been given something to consider, something that would stay with them long after the moment had passed, something that could not be easily forgotten. Elijah Carter closed his fingers gently around the card, the edges resting firmly in his palm as if it belonged there, as if it always had, and for a moment he stood without speaking, without looking around, simply present in the quiet that had settled over the room like a final layer, something soft but undeniable, something that asked nothing more from anyone but to feel it fully. Stephen Whitmore did not interrupt, did not try to fill the silence this time, and that alone marked how much had changed, because earlier he would have moved quickly, would have redirected, would have restored the rhythm he was used to controlling, but now he remained still, watching, not as a manager overseeing a situation, but as a man witnessing the consequence of a moment he could not undo. Elijah glanced once at the folded bill on the table, then slowly pushed it back towards Stephen with a light touch, not rejecting it, not accepting it, simply returning it to where it belonged. And in that small gesture there was a quiet message that needed no explanation, that some things could not be measured in dollars, that some exchanges had already taken place on a level far beyond transaction. The overhead lights cast a warm reflection across the table, catching the movement of his hand, the stillness of Stephen's posture, the space between them that now held something far different from what it had at the beginning, and as Elijah straightened slightly, adjusting the worn edge of his coat, the room seemed to follow the motion, as if everyone present understood, without being told, that the moment was reaching its natural end. He turned toward the door, not abruptly, not with finality, but with a calm that felt complete. As though he had taken exactly what he needed from the situation and left behind exactly what was meant to remain, and as he began to walk, his steps were steady, unhurried, each one carrying him away from the table, away from the eyes that now followed him not with curiosity or judgment, but with a quiet respect that had not been there before. The soft sound of his shoes against the floor echoed gently in the stillness, a simple rhythm that replaced the earlier laughter, the earlier noise, and as he moved past the tables, people shifted slightly, not in avoidance, but in acknowledgement, creating space without being asked, their expressions thoughtful, reflective, as if they were carrying something with them that they had not expected to receive. Stephen remained where he was, his gaze following Elijah, not with authority, not with expectation, but with something quieter, something more introspective, and as the distance between them grew, it became clear that whatever had changed in that moment would not remain confined to the space between two people. It would extend beyond it, shaping what came next in ways that could not yet be fully seen. Elijah reached the door and paused for just a second, his hand resting on the handle, the cool metal catching the light, and without turning back, without saying anything, he stepped outside, the door closing softly behind him, the faint sound marking the end of the moment in a way that felt both final and open at the same time. Inside, the room remained still for a breath longer, as if holding on to the silence just a little more before letting it go, and then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, life began to return, a chair shifting, a glass being lifted, a conversation resuming in hushed tones, but nothing felt quite the same, because something had been seen, something had been understood, and once that happens, it does not disappear. Stephen looked down at the table once more. At the place where the card had rested, at the folded bill now. Sitting quietly where it had been returned, and he did not move to pick it up right away, instead letting his hand rest lightly on the edge of the table, his reflection faintly visible in the polished surface, a man no longer standing exactly where he had been before, no longer seeing the world in quite the same way, and in the soft glow of the lights, in the quiet hum of a room slowly finding its rhythm again. The absence left behind by Elijah Carter carried more presence than any words could have, a reminder that sometimes the most powerful moments are the ones that end not with a statement, but with silence, leaving behind a truth that continues to speak long after the door has closed.